I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I take you back to 1972, September of that year, when an organization suddenly emerges called Black September. Black September murders Israelis at the Olympics, on camera, on stage for the world to see, violently, ruthlessly. Soon enough, the same organization in March of 1973 launches operations in the region, in the Middle East, kidnapping, abducting American charge d'affaires George Curtis Moore, at the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum, along with Cleo Noel Jr., U.S. Ambassador to Sudan, and Guy Ide, the Belgian Embassy's charge d'affaires. All three are murdered by Black September. At the same time, we now know, in New York City, the visit of Golda Meir, then the Prime Minister of Israel, there is an assassination plot that comes to the point of parking vehicles loaded with Semtex and gasoline, 3 vehicles around the Israeli embassy meant to detonate as the Prime Minister arrives. That plot fails by accident. It is not interrupted. It fails by accident. Consider what the world have been with the assassination of Golda Meir in March of 73 in the streets of New York. Consider where we would be today. These 3 incidents strike me as necessary to explain in light of where we are here in the 21st century, 40 years later. A new book, State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State, by Jonathan Schanzer, who is Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, helps me gather up all these disparate facts and these failed assassinations and successful mass murders and put them together and see the Palestinian cause for what it is today. Jonathan, a very good evening to you. I begin with Black September because it is so spectacular, because to consider that attack in New York is numbing. It's numbing today. However, I want to confirm that Black September movement was always and only about the Palestinian revolution, that it was always and only about organizations we've come to call by many names, Fatah, the PLO, the PA. Good evening to you, Jonathan.
Good evening, John. That is absolutely correct. Declassified State Department cables have confirmed that the Khartoum operation, the one that you mentioned that took place in March 1973 at the Saudi embassy in Sudan, was carried out with the full knowledge of Yasser Arafat, that the Fatah faction was involved in that, and that, in fact, Fatah was involved with the transport of terrorists to the embassy that evening. And so, we've heard over time that the Black September was separate or disparate from the PLO or from the Fatah faction. I think the facts now reveal that was certainly not the case.
We'll begin with Fatah. That is an organization that is now associated with Yasser Arafat. It begins in the 1950s, I believe, during the Eisenhower years. What is its aim at the beginning? How does it see its mission before it becomes all these other iterations?
Well, the Fatah faction was born in a very dark period for Palestinian politics. In fact, there really were no Palestinian politics to speak of at that time. This is only several years after the creation of the State of Israel. Palestinian nationalism is effectively defunct, and so there are a number of young Palestinians living in Kuwait who come up with this idea that they themselves need to spark a revolution that would effectively bring down the State of Israel through violence. And that's what Fatah was about back in the 1950s. That extended into the 1960s. In fact, the Fatah faction was in some ways responsible for the escalation of tensions leading up to the 1967 war. And then following that, the Fatah faction became the dominant faction within the PLO, which, of course, is the umbrella organization responsible for the coordination of multiple violent Palestinian factions.
At some point between the 1950s and 1964, Arafat moves in to take over. He is an Egyptian national, a failed Egyptian soldier, and he designs after that Arafat for its own purpose, Fatah for his own purposes. Is that discontinuous with Fatah's founding or its other elements?
Well, look, I think there's no question that Arafat kind of hijacked the organization and made it something of a cult of personality for him alone. But I think that he had, along the way, found rich Gulf donors who supported this. He found himself to be the personality who could drive this. And the fact that it got increasingly violent over time, more spectacular attacks, was very much in line with his vision of the way that the Palestinian cause would garner attention on the world stage.
The reason I ask, Jonathan, is because often as I come to the story of the Palestinians, it's presented as an ambition, a quest, a dream of a people's to be settled, to have their own state, or to return to lands they were dislodged from during the wars, 48, 56, 67. However, when I read it, it reminds me very much of organizations that become one man in over the course of time, and that it's foolish to debate now the founding circumstances of, say, the Bolsheviks in 1915 to 1918, or what becomes the National Socialists in the 1920s. It's best to talk about one man, Lenin, or it's best to talk about one man, Adolf Hitler. Is that an analogy that works for the Fatah and for its iterations today, that it's Arafat, it's only Arafat?
I think, look, there's no way that you can talk about the Palestinian nationalist movement without talking about the influence of Yasser Arafat, or as they called him, Abu Ammar. That he had such a pervasive influence, and that he single-handedly defined the movement on so many levels. I mean, when you talked about the Palestinians in the 1970s or 1980s, you can just almost envision the one man wearing the keffiyeh with the sunglasses and the 2 or 3 day old stubble and the fatigues with the holster at his side. This is exactly the image that he sought to project, and he made himself the sort of George Washington of the Palestinian movement. The problem is that the ideology of Palestinian nationalism was so tainted by the environment that he cultivated. He was so hell bent on bringing violence to the doorstep of the Israelis and to creating these spectacular attacks on the world stage. The Palestinian leadership during this formative time spent very little time and effort thinking about how they would actually create a state of their own, and how that would eventually evolve into the state of Palestine, as it were. These were things that were given short shrift as the Palestinians really devoted far too much attention on the violence and the spectacular.
In 1974, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is yet nascent and is an outgrowth, one of the iterations of this Fatah, Arafat cult of personality, as you say, Jonathan, gets recognized observer status at the United Nations during Gerald Ford's presidency. Now, 40 years later, I ask this innocent question: rewarding failure, is that the pattern we're about to follow through the next all the administrations between Gerald Ford and today?
It absolutely is, and this is the thrust of the book, and that is that the Palestinians have actually not achieved what they've sought out to achieve. I mean, dating back to really to the early years of this movement. There was that moment in 1974 when Yasser Arafat got up in front of the UN and talked about bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun, and he said, "Don't let the olive branch fall from my hand." And that was sort of a moment for the Palestinians. But the problem is that even after that, Arafat continued in the pursuit of the spectacular violent attacks that the PLO was so known for. And all during that time, you had a PLO that moved around throughout the region. It first created a state within a state inside Jordan. From Jordan, it went to Lebanon. It was kicked out of Jordan in the midst of a brutal civil war. The same thing happened again in Lebanon. They were ousted from Lebanon by the Israelis, and then finally moved to Tunisia. And each one of these places, you had a PLO that continued to embrace violence, was a bloated bureaucracy, wasteful, and certainly not transparent in any way. And so the Palestinians never got closer to that dream of being able to create a functioning, even a state in waiting. And that ultimately was rewarded time and again by the West. We have continued to elevate one president after the next, and I document this in the second chapter of my book. One American president after the next has elevated the stature of the Palestinians, and this is true from Democrats to Republicans. They continue to look with favor, increased favor, of the idea of a Palestinian state.
I'm speaking with Jonathan Schanzer. His new book is State of Failure: Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Jonathan Schanzer of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. His new book is State of Failure: Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. Both sides of the aisle, all manner of presidents, Mr. Ford, Mr. Carter, Mr. Reagan, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, and Bush, all seeking to find a way to bring Yasser Arafat to the negotiating table, to that dovishness he claims that he has. He's said to have taken over the PLO in 1969. However, Jonathan, my understanding here is that Arafat was clever at creating these alphabet soups of organizations. The PFLP that is violent in 1975. We mentioned Black September. All of these alphabet soups, the Al-Aqsa Brigade that will be created, they're all extensions of him. At least that's how Stalin ran it. He ran parallel terror and security operations that spied on each other and that only reported to him. Is that how Arafat set this up?
Absolutely. And look, I think part of the initial PLO umbrella, I think he only had nominal control of some of those alphabet soup groups. I think that the real power was consolidated after the creation of the Palestinian Authority in the 1990s. We saw this, I think, most visibly in the Second Intifada of 2000 to 2005, when Arafat called for the million martyrs to march on Jerusalem, and it was at that point that you saw, the Palestinian security apparatus, groups called the 417, the Tanzim, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which you just mentioned. All of them are now fighting the Israelis. Arafat claims to not have any control over any of them, but as we find out as the Israelis raid different Palestinian depots and other Palestinian bases, they continue to come up with documentation that shows that Arafat has been moving Palestinian Authority money into the hands of fighters from all these different groups. And so, yes, he was trying to control the chaos. He was the central hub for all of this mess that took place as the peace process unraveled.
And yet there's this mystery in your book, Jonathan, and I ask for your help on this. Arafat was a devil, and certainly qualifying as a devil of the region similar to the world-class devils of the 20th century. We know their names too well. However, again and again, when it was demonstrated, when it was illustrated, there was this pushback or resistance by the Israeli governments, several prime ministers, all manner of defense ministers in Israel, because they could deal with Arafat, because they could deal with Arafat's power. In fact, you have a quote from Dennis Ross, a distinguished ambassador who served here into the 21st century. Every time we push forward issues related to the rule of law, we would get pushback from the Israelis saying, don't apply those kinds of standards to Arafat. We want him to be able to arrest people. So Arafat becomes a pet butcher, a dictator you can deal with. Is that the cynicism we're dealing with here, Jonathan, through the end of the 20th century into the 21st?
Look, it absolutely is, and by the way, it's not just limited to the Palestinians. I mean, this was de facto American policy in places like Egypt and Tunisia and beyond, and I think in many ways it gave rise to the phenomenon we now call the Arab Spring. that U.S. policymakers have consistently relied on people in the region who can control the chaos that simmers beneath the surface in Middle Eastern countries, rather than trying to help foster a true democracy. With the case of Arafat, I think this certainly kind of punctuates this phenomenon. Arafat was largely kind of pushed out of the picture after being kicked out of Lebanon after the Civil War, and he was in exile in Tunisia. And when the first Intifada, erupted in 1987, he was largely kept out of the picture. He was watching helplessly as Palestinians rediscovered their national identity. When that Intifada started to get out of hand, he began to indicate to Western policymakers that he could potentially bring it under control, that if he were able to get back into these territories, that he could make some order out of this chaos. And that really began this trend of relying on a guy who was absolutely an iron-fisted autocrat, who we invited back into the scene to reassemble some of this order. And once he's back in power throughout the 1990s, he consolidates that power significantly. All decisions are made by Arafat himself and a small number who surround him. And ultimately, we find that we had bet on the wrong horse. That by 2000, as the United States tries to broker a final status agreement with Arafat, he ultimately determines that this is not in his interest any longer, and rather than negotiating, he launches a war against Israel, which is the undoing of the Palestinian Authority. It becomes a shambles by 2004 when he dies, and all hell breaks loose on the Palestinian street.
I want to turn to Hamas in a moment, but I want to finish this thought. We have that saying, low expectations of prejudice in this country. This tells me that over 40 years, maybe 70 years, the significant diplomats in all countries have no expectations of the Palestinians. I can be extremely cynical about this, Jonathan. You've worked on it much, much more than anyone else I know. Is that it, Jonathan? Do we have no expectations? Do we treat the Palestinians as the regional dogs that we're going to worry about and gather money for, but never expect them to behave like a recognizable sovereign state?
Well, you make an excellent point. Let me just give you an example. We continue to hear that the Palestinian issue, that the Palestinian struggle for self-governance or struggle for independence is the most crucial issue in the Middle East,
right,
and that it is the crux of everything else that takes place in the region.
That's exactly what President Obama said when he took office. Solve this and everything's solved. Yes. That's
right, and that is the mantra. We hear it across the region. Now, just to put things into perspective, I don't even know if there is another analyst in Washington that dedicates as much time to studying the Palestinian domestic political system as I do, which is remarkable. So the Palestinians are supposed to be the crux of everything, and if we can just solve this, then we can get to the bottom of everything. And yet no one studies the Palestinian system as such. Sure, there will be people looking at the Palestinians in terms of what they're willing to give the Israelis and what the Israelis are willing to give them. Yes, there are those who study the Palestinian terrorist groups. But what about the political system itself? Those who run the Palestinian Authority, trying to understand who makes the decisions, how the decisions are made, how the bureaucracy functions.
Let's talk about that next. Just a moment. State of Failure, Jonathan Schanzer's new book. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I'm speaking with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Jonathan Schanzer. His new book is State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. I have been attracted, of course, to the violence, and Mr. Schanzer is now making it very clear to me that the governance questions are the ones that need to be answered here. So, Jonathan, before we come back, return to the PA, which comes out of the Oslo Accords in the 1990s and the consolidation of power by the warlord Yasser Arafat, the birth of Hamas. This is a puzzle because, as I understand it, Yasser Arafat never had control of Hamas because territorially it's in the Gaza Strip, a piece of beachfront real estate that would be spectacularly worthwhile for investor class and for vacationing, except for it's in the hands of a violent group born in 1987, empowered in elections in the 21st century to be a separate entirely from the Palestinian Authority. The original Hamas charter and what it's become, is this a recapitulation of Fatah and the PLO of the 20th century?
It is, and it is. It's interesting that basically the Hamas faction grew at a time when the Fatah faction began to embrace this idea of at least tacitly recognizing the state of Israel and negotiating with it. And so what happened was that the Fatah faction, the primary faction of the PLO, as they relinquished the role of revolutionary, they opened up a vacuum for Hamas to step in. And the reason why Hamas was able to step in, I think, as strongly as it did is, it embraced this idea of continued violence against the Israelis, which has always appealed to a broad cross-section of the Palestinian population. But they also married this nationalist idea with religion, with Islamism. And this was extremely compelling. In other words, the Fatah faction always saw themselves as more of the 1970s revolutionary, almost socialist brand of revolutionary. And now all of a sudden, in sort of a more modern incarnation, marrying that nationalist, that very compelling nationalist narrative with jihadism. These are two very powerful forces that really grab the Palestinians by the lapels and really accounts for a lot of the reason why Hamas has become as popular as it has.
Hamas is linked and directly linked to the Muslim Brothers. And the Muslim Brothers win spectacularly in the Arab Spring and now are in eclipse or in shadow. Let's be metaphorical about this. Is Hamas now today an independent organization of its roots in Cairo? Was it always independent? I've never been able to see through that fog of war.
Well, Hamas, I think, was initially founded as a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood. They saw themselves as actually the reason why they splintered is because they embraced violence when the rest of the Brotherhood was not willing to do so. Following that, there was a period where you had countries like Saudi Arabia sponsoring Hamas. They were eager to basically land blows against the Israelis. And then after that ended, by around 2003, 2004, when the Saudis began to peel back on their support for Hamas, then you saw the rise of the Iran-Hamas relationship, which existed up until actually just last year when there was a falling out between Hamas and Iran over the civil war in Syria. Today, and look, during each one of these times, the Saudi period, the Iranian period, we very much saw Hamas as a client of these state sponsors. Today, we're at a very strange position where the Brotherhood was once a supporter. I mean, just even last year, they were supporters of Hamas. Now you have the rise of Turkey and Qatar as Hamas supporters. But this is a very uneasy place for Hamas. They usually like to have one strong alliance.
Puzzle about Hamas and its relationship to the Palestinian Authority. In the 21st century, and you devote a chapter to this, there's a civil war. This civil war after Arafat's death. So are we fighting over spoils? Is this warlordism, Hamas representing the powerful arm? It wins the election and then it takes on the IDF in 2006 and again 2008 to 2009. And Abbas has no comparable force. I know that's a generality, but I'm trying to now imagine what Hamas is compared to the PA today.
Sure. Well, after Arafat died, it was unclear who was actually in charge of the Palestinian Authority. But one also has to understand that when Arafat launched that war against Israel in 2000, the Israelis actually committed an unforced error. What they began to do was to hammer the PLO's infrastructure. And the more they did that, the more they weakened the PLO, allowing Hamas to get stronger. So that by the time that Arafat dies in November 2004, they're at roughly even strength. And so following that, there's this leadership vacuum. Mahmoud Abbas is brought in, but it's very difficult for him to take over because Arafat had ruled with such an iron fist, because he had centralized the decision-making process so greatly. It was extremely difficult for Abbas to come in and make sense of things, not to mention the fact that Abbas himself is not the kind of compelling leader that Arafat had been. I mean, this is a guy who looks more like an accountant than a revolutionary. And so Hamas takes advantage of this, and by 2006 they run in these elections. The first time that Hamas elects to do so, they win by a large margin, and that really begins a power struggle that continues to this day. There has been a military conflict that led to Hamas being in full control of the Gaza Strip. And as I like to say, at this point, these two factions can't agree on the color of hummus. They have completely differing views of who should rightly lead the Palestinian people. They have two separate mini-states with two separate governments, funding sources. They actually speak in Gaza, they speak a different dialect than they do in the West Bank, different economies. You can't imagine how detrimental this split has been to the Palestinian nationalist movement. And this, when we talk about failures, is probably one of the greatest that took place on Mahmoud Abbas's watch.
To be cynical once again, the two-state solution is at hand. It just happens to be two Palestinian states, neither of them at peace or transparent. Mahmoud Abbas, born 1935. He's originally the prime minister and I think interior minister, some cabinet position under Arafat. This is 2003, during the first Bush administration. And then Arafat is gone and Abbas is elevated, elected once upon a time, elected by the PA. And yet I find him, and he grew up sometimes in Syria, sometimes in the whole region. He grew up in a fashion that is not violent, and you make the remark that the reason he's still standing is because the Israelis never believed that he was worth killing, as many of the violent leadership was. So you get what you pay for, Jonathan. Abbas is about money. Follow the money. And if I follow your argument today, the non-transparency of the Palestinian Authority is all about diverting funds that come from Europeans and the United Nations into bank accounts that have no contact with the Palestinian people. It's become one large shakedown, criminal shakedown, and Abbas is at the head of it, even if he's not directing it.
Well, look, I think first you need to step back and take a look at what happened during the Arafat era. Even during the PLO in the 1970s and 1980s, you saw a huge amount of waste, all sorts of reports about just a bloated bureaucracy, one that showered riches on what they called the Abus, those who had been in exile in Lebanon and Jordan and Tunisia. Then you have the creation of the Palestinian Authority, and we've heard quite a lot about Arafat's billions. In the book, I interview one of the individuals who's involved in the accounting of trying to pull together all of Arafat's bank accounts and to centralize them into a sovereign wealth fund because of the demand by the Palestinians, no less, for better transparency on the finances. And during the Arafat era, it's also important to note that there were billions of dollars that were plowed into the Palestinian Authority. And at the end of that peace process, when the Intifada broke out in 2000, the Palestinian Authority was in no better position to declare a state. The infrastructure was simply not there. And you had Palestinians walking around scratching their heads. Where did the money go? Then you fast forward to the rise of Mahmoud Abbas, and I have to admit that there was a period where it looked like they were about to get their house in order. Then this split occurred with the Hamas faction, and it was at that point that I believe that the West really relinquished all expectations of Mahmoud Abbas. We failed to hold him account. All we wanted him to do was to stay in power and to not let Hamas come to power. And it's at that point that we began to hear more and more reports about diversion of funds or misallocation of funds or nepotism or waste. And the narrative of the waste and the nepotism and corruption has just really been a nonstop one since the creation of the PA, if not before that. And that was really the thing that struck me as I wrote this book, is this is a narrative that just about every observer in the region is aware of, but very few have tried to document. I tried to do that in this book.
I want to go to that narrative because that is my reading of a way of talking about this governance that emerged without statehood. The governance, the question of diverting funds or abusing funds started long time ago, before before Abbas, even before Arafat took control of the process in Oslo. And it's been operating like to use your word, Jonathan, an ossified state for 30 or 40 years. This didn't get created when Arafat died. There are very, very complicated and deliberately hidden relationships between people. After all, you've taught me a word. Who are the Abus, A-B-U-S, Jonathan?
So the Abus were the senior PLO cadres who were first operating out of Jordan, and then they were kicked out of Jordan after that civil war. Then they went to Lebanon, and they operated there. And then they went to Tunisia, and then from Tunisia they went to the West Bank or Gaza. In each case, we continue to hear about how the Abus were living in villas, how they were driving around in armored-plated Mercedes, how they had vacation homes in Tunisia or Jordan or in Lebanon or in other places around the Gulf. In some cases, we heard about some of the senior cadres that had established monopolies over some aspect of a business inside the Palestinian territories. These are the sorts of things that we've heard, again, time and time again. And again, when you ask some of these senior officials from the United States, those who have been involved in the process of peacemaking, everyone is aware of the fact that these Abus are out there and that they are living basically on funds that have at least been in some way connected to the American taxpayer dollar on some level or another. And there's an awareness of this, but yet an inability to want to tackle it. And the reason for that, and I will quote Aaron David Miller, who was one of the top peacemakers during the Clinton years, is that we continue to focus on the transaction over the transformation. The idea of just trying to get a deal done where you would get that handshake on the White House lawn, or you'd be able to get that state of Palestine established at the expense of the changes that would be needed to make sure that there was a transparent government that would be trusted by the Palestinian people and trusted, in fact, by the international community. And this has been an unforced error that has been made time and again, leading to what I call the state of failure.
The book is State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State by Jonathan Schanzer. When we come back, unilateralism and lawfare. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Jonathan Schanzer's new book is State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, but now the Mahmoud Abbas and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. Beginning in 2012 at the United Nations and continuing, to my knowledge, to this day, Abbas has launched what can be called unilateralism, what can be called lawfare, seeking recognition at various bodies attached to the United Nations in order to shoehorn or backdoor Palestinian Authority into statehood at the United Nations. Why, Jonathan? How does this gain Abbas anything?
Well, the campaign began in 2005, and I think it was a recognition on the part of Abbas and some of the senior Palestinian leadership that the two-state solution was really not going very well. This is, of course, right at the end of the Second Intifada, where there was quite a bit of damage done, and trust between Israel and the Palestinians was at an all-time low. And so the Palestinians began to reach out initially in places like Latin America, which is where I believe this campaign was born, but it certainly ultimately extended into to Europe and Asia. And the idea was to get countries to support the idea of the declaration of the State of Palestine at the UN. And so, in other words, this was the unilateral track. The bilateral track was working with the Israelis and negotiating all these tough issues like Jerusalem and borders and settlements and all the things that we hear about in the news. The Palestinians decided that that was sort of not as much. It was too much work. That it was inconvenient to try to do all these things, and especially if they were going to have to compromise on a lot of these things. And so over the course of several years, culminating in 2011 and then 2012, the Palestinians first went to the UN and got support for going to the Security Council. The Security Council turned it down because of a U.S. veto. The Obama administration said that this was not something that they would support, and obviously one veto at the Security Council will end that bid. And so the Palestinians went back again. That was 2011. Then they went back again in 2012, just last year, and they decided to get membership through the General Assembly for a Palestinian state. They got it overwhelmingly. I think it was 130-something countries out of 193. And since that time, they have continued to get support from countries around the world. You're looking at the elevation of the diplomatic missions of the PLO worldwide, with the idea that at some point they will want to get back to the UN, try to declare that state, and to become the 194th state. They call this campaign Palestine 194. They believe that enough diplomatic pressure on the United States and on some of the other countries that oppose, such as Canada, perhaps some of the other European countries, they believe that eventually they're going to get their way. And I think they're probably right.
You have 14 points, like Woodrow Wilson, for the future, and I want to focus on the second one. You mentioned an essay by a professor, Nathan Brown, at George Washington University, that's been faulted for glasses half empty approach, and yet you endorse that as the way forward. What is it, and how so, Jonathan?
Well, we need to keep our expectations high. You had mentioned before this idea of the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes.
That was a term coined by George W. Bush. I think that we need to continue to hold the Palestinians to account, not because we're opposed to Palestinian statehood, but because if, in fact, there is going to be a state, we need to make sure that it is a functioning one that can operate side by side with the Israelis, who are operating at a rather high level. The last thing you want to do is to create that kind of friction. And so we're talking about really holding everybody to account. This was the approach of then Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, who really took a very proactive approach to institution building and to countering corruption. He was unfortunately edged out of power by Mahmoud Abbas, by the sitting president of the Palestinian Authority. He was the best chance we had for it. I think we've kind of ended our expectations of the Palestinians. The hope of this book is to reignite those expectations again.
And the question of low expectations, high expectations, because I've followed your cases for 40 or 50 years, is it in the best interests of American and European politicians to ignore the past, to start everything all over as if they're inventing the idea of peace with the Palestinians? Is that the answer, Jonathan? Is that why we can't hold our politicians accountable for their conduct?
Look, I think if there's one thing that I make clear in this book is that if you ignore history, you ignore it at your peril. That the Palestinians have a checkered past when it comes to their own self-governance, that they've not taken it seriously enough, and that we've not taken it seriously enough. And I have issued these warnings throughout Washington where I work, and I've made it clear that I think that if we try to just simply flip a switch and turn the Palestinian Authority into the state of Palestine and then walk away, we are going to be in big trouble. That you are going to see a Palestinian polity that will not be able to function, that will be completely reliant on foreign aid, and that we still don't have a system to process that aid to make sure that it props up a solid middle class and keeps a bureaucracy functioning. And so, I continue to warn that this is not the way forward. This is, again, not to say that we should completely oppose a Palestinian state in principle. It's that if you're going to do it right, and make sure that you don't have to do it again. And that's where I think we've really gone off the rails in terms of foreign policy here, We're just picking up where we left off, as you say. There's a sense on the part of John Kerry that all you need to do is to get the two sides to agree on a couple of borders and about the status of Jerusalem and some refugees, and the deal is done. What I try to show here is that it's far more complicated than that, and I think that ignoring that, we do it at our peril.
Jonathan Schanzer. The book is State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.